An idea is the most resilient parasite. It is a seed that can be planted in the mind, where it can grow to define a person, a movement, a nation. It can build cathedrals, launch ships into the cosmos, and inspire acts of unimaginable compassion. But a seed can also grow into a twisted, thorny thing, a weed that chokes the very garden of civilization it was meant to cultivate. Some ideas are not just wrong, they are dangerous. Some are not just misguided, they are weapons. This is not a story about evil men, not in the simple, straightforward way we often imagine them. This is a story about brilliant, often well-intentioned men whose thoughts escaped the confines of their books and became something monstrous in the real world. It is an investigation into the most dangerous minds in history, not because they wielded swords or commanded armies, but because they wielded ideas so powerful, so seductive, and so volatile that they could be forged into justifications for tyranny, oppression, and mass murder. We will journey from the smoke-filled factories of industrial England to the hallowed halls of ancient Athens, from the paranoid terror of revolutionary France to the jackbooted rallies of Nazi Germany. We will dissect the works of thinkers whose names you know, Marx, Nietzsche, Rousseau, and we will ask a terrifying question. Can a philosopher be held responsible for the crimes committed in his name, decades or even centuries after his death? How does a search for truth become a blueprint for a lie? How does a dream of utopia pave the road to hell? This is the story of the perilous power of thought. It is a reminder that the most important battles are not fought on fields of mud and blood, but in the silent, infinite spaces of the human mind. The ideas we are about to explore did not die with their creators. They are still with us, embedded in our political systems, our cultures, and our own assumptions about the world. And they remain as dangerous as ever. Our investigation begins not with a man who craved power, but with a man who sought to understand it. He was a recluse, a man of profound sickness and even more profound insight. He spent his life wandering the mountains of Switzerland and the coast of Italy, his mind a whirlwind of creation. He warned of the darkness to come, yet his own words would be used to light its fires. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. To understand Nietzsche, you must first understand the world he was born into. The year is 1844. Europe is a continent in flux. The old certainties of God, king, and country are beginning to crumble under the relentless pressures of industrialization, science, and a new aggressive form of nationalism. Germany, for centuries a fractured collection of states, is on the verge of unification under the iron will of Otto von Bismarck. It is a new empire, forged in blood and iron, pulsating with industrial might and a desperate need for a new identity. This was Nietzsche's world, a world of profound spiritual anxiety. The foundations of Western civilization, which for 2 millennia had rested on the bedrock of Christian morality, were cracking. The Enlightenment had championed reason. Darwin had dismantled the biblical account of creation, and the relentless machinery of the modern economy was grinding traditional ways of life into dust. Nietzsche saw this not as a distant threat, but as an immediate, catastrophic event. He gave it a name that would echo through the 20th century: the death of God. For Nietzsche, the death of God was not a celebratory declaration of atheism. It was a diagnosis, a cry of alarm. He saw that the entire system of Western values, our concepts of good and evil, our belief in objective truth, our sense of purpose, was predicated on a belief in the Christian God. With that foundation removed, the entire structure was doomed to collapse. Humanity, he predicted, was plunging into a great void, a period of nihilism where all values would be rendered meaningless. Nietzsche asked the most terrifying question of the modern age. If God is dead, and with him the source of all morality, what is to stop us from doing anything? What will prevent the descent into chaos? He believed this crisis, this abyss of meaninglessness, was the greatest danger humanity had ever faced. But it was also, he thought, our greatest opportunity. For if the old values were gone, then humanity was finally free to create new ones. This is the crucible in which his most famous and most dangerously misunderstood concepts were forged. He spoke of the will to power. This was not, as it would later be portrayed, a crude desire for political domination over others. For Nietzsche, the will to power was the fundamental driving force of all life, a striving for growth, for expansion, for overcoming obstacles, for becoming more than what one is. A tree reaching for the sun, an artist struggling to perfect their craft, a philosopher pushing the boundaries of thought. This was all the will to power. And from this, he conceived of the Übermensch, often translated as the Superman or Overman. The Übermensch was not a biological specimen, not a member of a master race. The Übermensch was the individual who, in the wake of God's death, confronts the abyss of nihilism and triumphs over it. He is the one who rejects the herd morality of good and evil and creates his own values, living life as a work of art. He is the goal humanity could set for itself, a symbol of ultimate self-overcoming. Nietzsche was an elitist, an aristocrat of the spirit. He despised the mediocrity he saw in modern society, what he called the herd. He was a fierce critic of nationalism, which he called national neurosis. He was vehemently anti-Semitic, at one point writing, "I am having all anti-Semites shot." He broke with his friend, the composer Richard Wagner, in part over Wagner's virulent anti-Semitism and German nationalism. His philosophy was a deeply personal, individualistic call to arms against the suffocating conformity of his age. He wrote with a poetic, aphoristic style that was deliberately provocative and open to interpretation. He was not building a systematic philosophy. He was launching intellectual grenades. He wanted to shock his readers, to force them to question their deepest assumptions. And then, in 1889, at the age of 44, his brilliant mind, which had burned so brightly, collapsed into the darkness of insanity. He would spend the last decade of his life in a catatonic state, utterly unaware of the world and utterly unaware of what was about to be done to his legacy. Here, the story turns from a tragedy of the mind to a crime of intellectual theft. The chief culprit was not a politician or a general, but his own sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Elisabeth was everything her brother was not. Where Friedrich was a radical, cosmopolitan individualist, Elisabeth was a fervent, conventional German nationalist and a committed anti-Semite. She had married a leading anti-Semitic agitator, Bernhard Förster, and had even tried to establish a racially pure Aryan colony in Paraguay called Nueva Germania. After Friedrich's mental collapse, Elisabeth gained control of his literary estate. She became the gatekeeper of his genius, the high priestess of his legacy. She had access to mountains of his unpublished notebooks, filled with fragmented thoughts, aphorisms, and plans for future works. It was a gold mine of philosophical dynamite, and she held the detonator. She set about curating, editing, and in some cases, outright fabricating a version of her brother's philosophy that aligned with her own repugnant ideology. Her most notorious act was the creation of a book called The Will to Power. Nietzsche had considered writing a book with this title, but he abandoned the project. Elisabeth, however, took his scattered notes from his most productive period, tore them from their original context, rearranged them to fit her own narrative, and published this pastiche as her brother's definitive magnum opus. It presented a distorted, brutalist caricature of his thought, emphasizing themes of power, domination, and hierarchy while stripping them of all their philosophical subtlety. She established the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar, transforming her brother's legacy into a nationalist shrine. She selectively edited his letters, removing his frequent condemnations of anti-Semitism and German nationalism. She crafted an image of Friedrich Nietzsche not as the lonely, iconoclastic wanderer he was, but as a prophet of German greatness and racial purity. She was preparing his philosophy, dressing it up for a monstrous new suitor. That suitor arrived in the 1920s and 30s in the form of the nascent Nazi Party. The Nazis were in desperate need of an intellectual pedigree, a philosophical justification for their ideology of racial supremacy and brutal expansionism. In Elizabeth's carefully curated version of Nietzsche, they found exactly what they were looking for. Nazi ideologues like Alfred Daimler and Alfred Rosenberg hailed Nietzsche as a proto-fascist, a forerunner of their movement. They took the concept of the Übermensch, this deeply individualistic ideal of self-creation, and twisted it into a biological imperative. The Übermensch was no longer the creative individual who overcomes himself, but the Aryan master race, destined by blood and soil to rule over the Untermenschen, the so-called inferior peoples. It was a grotesque perversion of everything Nietzsche stood for, transforming a spiritual goal into a racial category. They seized upon the will to power, as presented in Elizabeth's forged book, and interpreted it as a simple lust for military and political domination. Nietzsche's complex idea about the fundamental striving of all life was reduced to a crude justification for Lebensraum, the conquest of living space in the East. His call to live dangerously was warped from a challenge to intellectual complacency into a celebration of militaristic aggression. Adolf Hitler himself was a great admirer of this Nazified Nietzsche. He was photographed staring pensively at a bust of the philosopher. He visited the Nietzsche archive in Weimar multiple times, where he was personally welcomed by an elderly Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. In one infamous photograph, he is seen accepting a gift from her, Nietzsche's walking stick. The symbolism was chilling. The Führer was picking up the mantle of the great prophet of the will to power. The Nazis presented Nietzsche as their own. His name was invoked in speeches, his phrases were plastered on propaganda posters. His book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, was placed in the pack of German soldiers alongside Mein Kampf. The philosopher who had written "The state is the coldest of all cold monsters" was now the official philosopher of the most monstrous state in modern history. The man who despised the blonde beast of German nationalism was used to justify its most horrific manifestation. This is the ultimate tragedy of Friedrich Nietzsche. His ideas were not just misinterpreted, they were systematically and maliciously corrupted. The very intellectual tools he had designed to dismantle the dogmas of his time were used to construct a new and far more terrible one. His celebration of the strong individual was used to justify the crushing of individuality. His critique of herd morality was used to enforce the most brutal herd mentality of all. Of course, the question remains, is Nietzsche entirely blameless? His writing style, with its explosive rhetoric and lack of system, left him vulnerable to this kind of appropriation. He wrote of the need for a new aristocracy, of the pathos of distance, of the importance of cruelty in shaping the human spirit. Phrases like these, torn from their context, could easily be made to sound like a proto-fascist manifesto. He played with philosophical fire, and his legacy was horrifically burned. But the historical record is clear. The Nietzsche of the Third Reich was a phantom, a caricature created by his nationalist sister and eagerly adopted by a criminal regime. The real Nietzsche was a man who championed the individual against the state, the artist against the herd, and the free spirit against the confines of any ideology, especially the hateful ideologies of nationalism and anti-Semitism. The weaponization of his work stands as one of history's most profound and cautionary tales of intellectual hijacking. How do we judge a mind like this? Is it dangerous because of what it said, or because of what others made it say? Does the power of a philosopher's words lie in their intended meaning or in their potential for misuse? As we leave the tragic figure of Nietzsche, we turn to another German thinker, a contemporary whose ideas would not be hijacked by a regime, but would instead become the very blueprint for creating them. We turn to a man whose vision of utopia would be paid for with the lives of nearly 100 million people. We turn to Karl Marx. Imagine the world as Karl Marx saw it in the mid-19th century. Step into the London or Manchester of the 1840s. The air is thick with coal smoke, a permanent gray shroud that chokes the sky. The noise is relentless, the deafening clang and hiss of machinery from the textile mills, the so-called dark satanic mills that never sleep. This is the heart of the Industrial Revolution, the engine room of a new global empire, and for millions, it is a living hell. Marx, a German exile living in London, walks these streets. He sees the immense wealth being generated, the grand new buildings, the opulent lifestyles of the factory owners, the bourgeoisie. But he also sees the other side of the ledger. He sees the men, women, and children who fuel this machine, the proletariat. He sees children as young as 6 working 14-hour days in the mills, their small fingers ideal for fixing jab machines, often at the cost of those same fingers. He sees families packed into squalid tenements with no sanitation, where diseases like cholera and typhoid run rampant. He sees a world of staggering, unprecedented inequality. A tiny minority owned the means of production, the factories, the machines, the land, while the vast majority owned nothing but their ability to work. And to work meant to sell your labor for a wage that was just enough to keep you alive to work another day. This wasn't just an unfortunate state of affairs for Marx. It was a scientific system of exploitation, and he dedicated his life to understanding and ultimately overthrowing it. Marx was not a mere moralist lamenting the plight of the poor. He saw himself as a scientist of history. Along with his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, he developed a theory he believed was as revolutionary as Darwin's theory of evolution. He called it historical materialism. The core idea is that the fundamental driver of all human history is not great men or politics or religion, but economics. Specifically, the history of all society is the history of class struggle. In every era, he argued, there is a dominant class that owns and controls the means of production, and an oppressed class that is forced to labor for them. In ancient Rome, it was masters and slaves. In feudal Europe, it was lords and serfs. And in his own time, under capitalism, it was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Each system, he claimed, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The struggle between these classes would inevitably lead to a revolutionary crisis, and a new system would emerge. Marx saw capitalism as the most productive and also the most brutal system yet devised. He marveled at its ability to create wealth, but he argued that this wealth was built on a fundamental injustice, the theft of surplus value. A worker might create $10 worth of value in an hour, but he is only paid $2 in wages. The remaining $8, the surplus value, is expropriated by the capitalist owner. This, for Marx, was the engine of capitalism, profit derived from the exploitation of labor. But the damage was not just economic. Marx introduced a profound and deeply influential concept, alienation. Under capitalism, the worker is alienated or estranged in multiple ways. He is alienated from the product of his labor. He builds a car he can never afford to own. He is alienated from the act of labor itself. His work is repetitive, mindless, and devoid of creativity. He is alienated from his own human nature, his potential to be a creative, fulfilled being. And finally, he is alienated from his fellow human beings, forced to compete with them for scarce jobs. This system, Marx argued, was inherently unstable. It was prone to ever-worsening economic crises. Competition would force capitalists to drive down wages and replace workers with machines, creating a vast reserve army of the unemployed and increasing the misery of the proletariat. Eventually, the workers, their class consciousness awakened, would realize their collective power. They would rise up, seize the means of production, and overthrow the bourgeois state. What would come next? This is where Marx's vision becomes both utopian and dangerously vague. He predicted a transitional phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. During this period, the working class would use the power of the state to suppress the remnants of the bourgeoisie and reorganize the economy. This would eventually lead to the final stage of history, communism, a classless, stateless society where the means of production are owned by all and the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need would prevail. It was a vision of ultimate human emancipation. For most of his life, Marx was an obscure theorist, scribbling away in the British Museum, living in poverty, supported by the generosity of Engels. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral. His ideas seemed destined for the dustbin of history. But the seed had been planted, and in the fertile ground of early 20th century Russia, it would sprout into a terrifying monster. The 1917 Russian Revolution was not the revolution Marx had predicted. It did not happen in a highly industrialized capitalist nation like Britain or Germany. It happened in a vast, impoverished, largely agrarian empire, devastated by its involvement in World War I. The revolution was not led by a spontaneous uprising of the industrial proletariat, but by a small, disciplined party of professional revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of one Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was Marx's first great and terrible interpreter. He took Marx's theories and adapted them to the specific conditions of Russia. Marx had been vague on the details of the revolution. Lenin provided the practical, ruthless playbook. He argued that the workers, left to themselves, would only ever develop a trade union consciousness, demanding better wages and conditions. They needed to be led by a vanguard party of hardened intellectuals who would guide them towards true revolutionary consciousness. This was a crucial and fateful addition to Marxism. The revolution would not be the work of the masses, but of an elite party acting in the name of the masses. And after seizing power, it was this party that would wield the dictatorship of the proletariat. The state, which Marx had predicted would begin to wither away, became, under Lenin, more powerful, more centralized, and more repressive than the Tsarist regime it had replaced. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, completed the transformation of Marxism from a theory of liberation into an ideology of total control. Stalin, the man of steel, was a master of bureaucratic infighting and brutal pragmatism. He consolidated absolute power, eliminating all his rivals within the party, most famously Leon Trotsky, who was hunted down and assassinated in Mexico. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a totalitarian state, and Marx's theory was dogmaticized into a rigid state religion known as Marxism-Leninism or dialectical materialism. Every aspect of life was to be subordinated to the will of the party and its infallible leader. Dissent was not just a political disagreement, it was a counter-revolutionary crime. The dictatorship of the proletariat became the personal dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, and the utopian dream of a worker's paradise was realized as a nightmare of secret police, show trials, and the vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. The scale of the human suffering is almost impossible to comprehend. To achieve the rapid industrialization that Marx had seen as a prerequisite for communism, Stalin launched his series of 5-year plans. Peasants were forced off their land and onto collective farms. Those who resisted, the so-called kulaks, were arrested, deported, or executed by the thousands. This forced collectivization led to a catastrophic drop in agricultural output, resulting in a man-made famine that killed millions, particularly in Ukraine, a genocide known as the Holodomor. Millions more were swept up in the Great Purge of the 1930s. Old Bolsheviks, military leaders, intellectuals, artists, engineers, and ordinary citizens were arrested on fabricated charges of treason and sabotage. They were tortured into confessing to impossible crimes, and then either executed with a bullet to the back of the head or sent to the gulag, where they were worked to death in the mines of Siberia or on massive construction projects. It was a system of terror designed to atomize society, to destroy any possible source of opposition to Stalin's rule. This Soviet model of communism, a perversion of Marx's original vision, became the template for other revolutionary movements in the 20th century. In China, Mao Zedong, another towering and terrible figure, adapted Marxism-Leninism to a peasant society. His rule brought about two of the greatest human-made catastrophes in history. The Great Leap Forward, a disastrous attempt to rapidly industrialize the country, led to a famine that killed an estimated 45 to 65 million people. Later, Mao unleashed the Cultural Revolution, a decade of chaos and violence designed to purge Chinese society of all remnants of capitalism and traditionalism. Young Red Guards were encouraged to denounce their teachers, their parents, and any figures of authority. Temples were destroyed, books were burned, and millions were persecuted, publicly humiliated, tortured, and killed. It was a society that had devoured its own past and its own people, all in the name of a distorted Marxist ideology. Perhaps the most extreme and horrifying application of Marxist ideas occurred in Cambodia. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized power. Influenced by a radical, agrarian interpretation of Maoism, they declared Year Zero and set about creating a purely communist society from scratch. They emptied the cities, forcing the entire urban population into the countryside to work as slave laborers in the killing fields. Money, private property, and religion were abolished. The family unit was dismantled. Anyone with an education, anyone who wore glasses, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone suspected of being an intellectual was targeted for execution. In just 4 years, the Khmer Rouge regime murdered an estimated 2 million people, nearly a quarter of the country's entire population. It was the logical, insane conclusion of an ideology that saw human beings not as individuals but as mere obstacles to be removed in the path to a perfect society. When you add up the numbers, the 20 million in the Soviet Union, the 65 million in China, the 2 million in Cambodia, and the millions more in North Korea, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, and Africa, the death toll of 20th century communism committed under the banner of Marx reaches an estimated 94 million people. It is the single most murderous ideology in human history. So we must ask the question, is Karl Marx to blame? Is the philosopher who spent his life in a library dreaming of human emancipation responsible for the mountains of skulls piled up by Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot? The defense of Marx is that these regimes were not a true application of his ideas, but a grotesque distortion. They were state capitalism, not communism. They occurred in pre-industrial societies, contrary to his predictions. They elevated the state to a position of absolute power when Marx believed the state would wither away. Marx himself was a humanist. His early writings are filled with a profound moral outrage at the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. His ultimate goal was to create a world where every individual could achieve their full potential, a world free from exploitation and alienation. He once wrote, "The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." This is hardly the motto of a totalitarian monster. However, the critique of Marx argues that the seeds of this totalitarianism are embedded within the very fabric of his thought. His dismissal of bourgeois concepts like individual rights, the rule of law, and private property as mere tools of class oppression provided a ready-made justification for their abolition. His call for a dictatorship of the proletariat, no matter how temporary he intended it to be, was a license for revolutionary terror and the suppression of all dissent. His deterministic view of history, which saw classes rather than individuals as the primary agents, could easily be used to justify the sacrifice of millions of living, breathing human beings for the sake of an abstract future utopia. If the kulaks or the bourgeoisie were on the wrong side of history, then their elimination was not a crime, but a historical necessity. Marx's ideas, in their certainty and their totality, created a framework in which unimaginable cruelty could be seen as a form of virtue. Marx's legacy is therefore profoundly, tragically paradoxical. He provided the most powerful and enduring critique of capitalism ever written, a critique that continues to resonate in our own era of growing inequality. He gave a voice to the voiceless and exposed the brutal realities of industrial exploitation. Yet, his name is inextricably linked to regimes that created a level of oppression and mass murder that would have made the 19th century capitalists he so despised blush. Was his idea the key to unlocking human freedom, or the combination to a prison that would engulf half the world? This question haunts us still. From the revolutionary fervor of the 19th century, we now travel back 100 years to the twilight of the old order in Europe. We arrive in an age of powdered wigs and glittering salons, an era that called itself the Enlightenment. It was a time of supreme confidence in the power of human reason to solve all problems. But one of its brightest stars was a man who questioned the very notion of progress, a man who would become the patron saint of a revolution that would end in a bloodbath. His name was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a man of staggering contradictions. He was born in Geneva in 1712, a watchmaker's son in a city of stern Calvinist rectitude. He was a composer, a novelist, a botanist, and a philosopher. He was a celebrated figure in the Parisian salons, yet he was deeply uncomfortable in high society. He wrote a groundbreaking treatise on education, yet he abandoned all 5 of his own children to an orphanage. He was a creature of the Enlightenment, yet his work was a profound critique of its core tenets. To understand Rousseau's danger, you must understand his starting point. While his contemporaries like Voltaire celebrated reason, science, and civilization, Rousseau argued that these were the very sources of human misery. In his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, he made the shocking claim that the restoration of the arts and sciences had tended to corrupt, not purify, morals. He believed that in our natural state as noble savages, we were free, equal, and compassionate. It was the invention of private property and the development of society that had chained and corrupted us. This idea that man is born good and is corrupted by society was revolutionary. It reversed the traditional Christian doctrine of original sin. It implied that our problems were not inherent to our nature, but were the result of a faulty social and political structure. And if that structure was the problem, then it could be torn down and rebuilt. This was an idea that would light a fire in the hearts of revolutionaries. His most famous and most consequential work is a short book published in 1762, The Social Contract. It begins with one of the most electrifying sentences in the history of political thought. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The book is an attempt to answer a fundamental question. How can we live together in a society that enhances our freedom rather than extinguishing it? How can we form a state that is legitimate? Rousseau rejects the idea that a legitimate state can be founded on force or on the divine right of kings. Instead, he argues, it must be founded on a social contract, a unanimous agreement among the people to come together and form a collective body, a republic. In doing so, each individual gives up their natural liberty, the freedom to do whatever they want. But in return, they gain a new, more profound kind of liberty, civil liberty, the freedom to live under laws that they themselves have made. This is where Rousseau introduces his most powerful and most perilous concept, the general will. The general will is not simply the sum of all the individual wills of the citizens. It is not what a majority wants. It is the collective will of the people directed towards the common good. It is what the people would want if they were all perfectly informed, rational, and concerned with the good of the whole community rather than their own private interests. A state is legitimate, Rousseau argues, only when its laws are an expression of this general will. When you obey such a law, you are not obeying a king or a parliament or even a majority. You are obeying yourself as a member of the collective body. True freedom for Rousseau is obedience to a law which we prescribe to ourselves. This is a profound and deeply democratic idea. It locates sovereignty, the ultimate authority to rule, squarely in the hands of the people. But within this elegant theory lies a terrifying paradox. What happens if an individual disagrees with the general will? What if their private will conflicts with the common good? Rousseau's answer is chilling. He writes that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This, he says, means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Forced to be free. Let that phrase sink in. It is an oxymoron that holds the key to the tyranny that would later be unleashed in Rousseau's name. He believed that the general will was always right, that it could never err, because it was by definition aimed at the public good. An individual who disagrees with it is therefore simply mistaken about what is in their own best interest. By forcing them to conform, you are not oppressing them. You are liberating them from their own error, making them truly free. This is a recipe for absolute power masquerading as absolute freedom. It provides a perfect justification for the suppression of all dissent. Any individual or group that opposes the state can be branded as an enemy of the people, a selfish private interest standing in the way of the common good. Minorities have no rights against the infallible general will. The very idea of individual rights, a cornerstone of liberalism, is subordinated to the collective. The state, as the embodiment of the general will, has the moral authority to do whatever it deems necessary to achieve the common good, including purging those who stand in its way. For a time, these were just ideas in a book. But in 1789, the French Revolution exploded, and Rousseau's philosophy was taken from the salons and put onto the streets. The revolutionaries, men like Maximilien Robespierre, saw themselves as the disciples of Rousseau. They were not just trying to reform a monarchy. They were trying to create a republic of virtue, a state founded on the principles of the social contract. Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible, was the leader of the radical Jacobin faction and the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety, the body that effectively governed France during the most violent phase of the revolution. He was a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness, a man who believed he was the living instrument of the general will. His speeches are filled with the language of Rousseau. He spoke of virtue, of the people, of the need to subordinate all private interests to the public good. As the revolution faced threats from foreign armies and internal counter-revolutionaries, the Jacobins decided that to save the Republic of Virtue, they needed to employ terror. This period, from 1793 to 1794, became known as the Reign of Terror. It was the moment when Rousseau's abstract paradox was written in blood. Robespierre provided the chilling philosophical justification. In a famous speech, he argued that terror was not an unfortunate necessity, but an essential component of virtue. He said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue." In the name of the general will, in the name of forcing the French people to be free, the Committee of Public Safety unleashed a wave of state-sanctioned murder. A law of suspects was passed, allowing for the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct, associations, comments, or writings, had shown themselves to be supporters of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. The definition was so vague that anyone could be targeted. Revolutionary tribunals were set up where the accused had few rights. To be accused was effectively to be condemned. Every day, the tumbrils rumbled through the streets of Paris, carrying the condemned to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine, the national razor, did its work. Thousands were executed, aristocrats like Queen Marie Antoinette, rival revolutionary factions, priests, peasants, anyone suspected of being an enemy of the new order. It was a paranoid frenzy of purification, a violent attempt to excise all selfish private interests from the body politic and create a unified people governed by a single general will. This was Rousseau's theory made terrifyingly real. The Committee of Public Safety saw itself as the embodiment of the general will, and Robespierre was its high priest. Those who were sent to the guillotine were not just being punished. They were being surgically removed from society for the health of the whole. They were being forced to be free from their own counter-revolutionary errors, a freedom that could only be found in death. The utopian dream of a society of free and equal citizens had become a totalitarian nightmare of surveillance, denunciation, and mass execution. The reign of terror eventually consumed its own creators. Robespierre, having sent so many of his former allies to their deaths, was himself overthrown and guillotined in July 1794. But the precedent had been set. Rousseau's ideas, particularly the concept of the general will and the paradox of being forced to be free, had provided the intellectual architecture for modern totalitarianism. Later totalitarian movements, from the communists to the fascists, would echo Rousseau's logic. They too would claim to represent the true will of the people, be it the proletariat, the nation, or the race. They too would justify the suppression of individual rights and the extermination of dissenters as a necessary step towards achieving a greater collective good. The idea that a small, virtuous elite can know the real interests of the people better than the people themselves is one of the most dangerous political ideas ever conceived, and it flows directly from the pages of the social contract. So, what is Rousseau's legacy? He is also, paradoxically, a hero of democratic thought. His insistence on popular sovereignty, the idea that the people should be their own masters, is a foundation of modern democracy. His critiques of inequality and his emphasis on compassion and the common good have inspired progressive movements for centuries. He championed the idea that all citizens should participate in the creation of the laws that govern them. But his work contains a fatal flaw, a totalitarian temptation. By creating an infallible, abstract entity, the general will, and granting it absolute power over the individual, he opened a Pandora's box of political terror. He failed to see that the greatest threat to liberty is often not a king or an aristocracy, but a tyranny of the majority, or worse, a tyranny of a minority claiming to speak for the majority. Is it possible to embrace Rousseau's democratic ideals without succumbing to the dangerous logic that allows a state to force its citizens to be free? As we leave the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris, we must travel much further back in time, to the very wellspring of Western philosophy. We journey to a city of sunlight and marble, a place that gave us democracy, tragedy, and the very idea of philosophy itself. We are going to ancient Athens to meet a thinker whose vision of a perfect society has been hailed as a masterpiece of wisdom and condemned as the first great blueprint for a totalitarian state. We are going to confront the legacy of Plato. Plato lived in the 4th century BCE, a time of crisis for his beloved Athens. He had lived through the catastrophic Peloponnesian War, which saw the defeat of Athens at the hands of its rival Sparta. More traumatically, he had witnessed the trial and execution of his mentor and hero Socrates in 399 BCE. The Athenian democracy, which Plato saw as mob rule, had condemned the wisest and most virtuous man he knew to death on trumped-up charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. This event profoundly shaped Plato's entire philosophical project. It convinced him that democracy was a fundamentally flawed system, and that the central problem of politics was how to prevent ignorance and passion from ruling over wisdom and justice. Plato's response to this problem was his most famous work, The Republic. It is a sprawling dialogue that seeks to define justice and, in the process, outlines a vision for an ideal state, a Kallipolis. To understand this ideal state, you must first grasp Plato's core metaphysical belief, the theory of forms. Plato believed that the physical world we perceive with our senses is not the real world. It is merely a world of shadows, a pale imitation of a higher, eternal, and perfect reality known as the world of forms. There is a perfect form of a circle, a perfect form of beauty, and, most importantly, a perfect form of the good. The true philosopher is the one who, through years of rigorous intellectual training, can turn away from the shadows of the physical world and apprehend these perfect forms with their mind. This metaphysical theory is the foundation of his political philosophy. If there is an objective, eternal truth about what is good and just, then the best state would be one ruled by those who have knowledge of this truth. Just as you would not want a ship to be steered by a popular vote of the passengers, but by a skilled navigator who understands the sea and the stars, you would not want a state to be governed by the whims of the ignorant masses. You would want it to be governed by those who have true knowledge, the philosopher kings. And so, Plato's ideal republic is a rigid, hierarchical society divided into three distinct classes based on their natural aptitudes. At the bottom are the producers, the farmers, artisans, and merchants who are driven by their appetites and are responsible for the economic life of the city. Above them are the auxiliaries, the warrior class, who are driven by spirit or courage and are responsible for defending the state. And at the very top is a small elite class of guardians, the philosopher kings, who are driven by reason and have the wisdom to rule justly. In this state, there is no social mobility in the modern sense. Each person has a specific role to play, and justice for Plato is defined as each part of the state performing its function and not interfering with the others. It is a vision of perfect order and harmony, where every citizen works for the good of the whole. But to achieve and maintain this perfect order, Plato proposes a series of measures that, to a modern reader, are deeply disturbing. First, there is the absolute rule of the philosopher kings. They have total political power. There are no elections, no checks and balances, no individual rights to protect citizens from the power of the state. The guardian's wisdom is considered a sufficient check. Democracy for Plato was one of the worst forms of government, just one step above tyranny, because it treats all people and all opinions as equal, when in fact they are not. Second, to ensure the unity and stability of the state, the guardians would employ widespread censorship and propaganda. All art, music, and literature would be strictly controlled by the state to ensure that it promotes only virtuous and patriotic messages. Stories that depict the gods as immoral or the afterlife as frightening would be banned, as they could undermine the courage of the warriors. The entire culture of the city would be engineered to mold the character of the citizens from birth. Most famously, Plato advocates for a noble lie, a foundational myth that would be told to all citizens to persuade them to accept their place in the social hierarchy. The myth is that all citizens are born from the earth, but the gods mixed different metals into their souls: gold for the philosopher kings, silver for the auxiliaries, and bronze or iron for the producers. This lie, Plato argues, is necessary to ensure social cohesion and prevent class conflict. Third, and perhaps most shockingly, Plato proposes a state-controlled eugenics program for the guardian class. To create the best possible rulers, the state would arrange temporary marriages between the best male and female guardians. The children of these unions would be taken from their parents at birth and raised in communal nurseries with no knowledge of their biological parents. This is done to destroy family loyalties and ensure that the guardian's primary allegiance is to the state alone. Children born of inferior parents or with defects would be disposed of. This is a vision of a society that is completely collectivized, where the individual is entirely subsumed by the state. It is a static, unchanging utopia, designed to be perfect and to last forever. There is no room for dissent, no room for individuality, no room for the messy, unpredictable business of human freedom. It is a society built on the principles of order, reason, and justice, but it is an order that is imposed from above, a reason that is accessible only to an elite few, and a justice that sacrifices individual liberty for the sake of collective harmony. For most of history, the Republic was read as a philosophical allegory, a brilliant but impractical exploration of the nature of justice. But in the 20th century, with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, Plato's work began to be seen in a much more sinister light. Thinkers like the philosopher Karl Popper, in his influential 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, launched a devastating attack on Plato, branding him as the first and most profound intellectual ancestor of modern totalitarianism. Popper argued that Plato's entire political project was a reaction against the dynamic, democratic, and individualistic open society that was beginning to emerge in Athens. Plato's ideal state, with its rigid class structure, its censorship, its racialist eugenics program, and its belief in a single, absolute truth possessed only by an elite, was a blueprint for the closed society. Popper saw a direct line from Plato's philosopher king to the 20th century Führer or general secretary, who also claimed to have a special insight into the laws of history or nature and used this claim to justify absolute power. Indeed, the parallels are chilling. The Nazi regime in Germany, with its obsession with racial purity, its eugenics programs, its state control of culture, and its rule by an elite party led by a Führer, seemed to be a grotesque realization of many of Plato's proposals. Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, was a known admirer of Plato's work, seeing in it a justification for his own authoritarian rule. The communist states, with their rule by a vanguard party, their suppression of dissent, and their subordination of the individual to the collective, also bear a disturbing resemblance to the Platonic ideal. Is this a fair assessment? The defense of Plato argues that it is anachronistic to judge an ancient philosopher by modern political standards. Plato was not a modern fascist. He had no concept of race in the modern sense, and his vision was, in his own mind, aimed at creating a just and virtuous society, not a brutal and expansionist one. His philosopher kings were supposed to be reluctant rulers who would rather be contemplating the forms than governing. They were to live an austere, communal life with no private property to prevent them from becoming corrupt. Furthermore, some scholars argue that the Republic was never intended as a practical blueprint for a real-world state. It may have been a thought experiment, an allegory for the just soul, in which reason, the philosopher king, should rule over spirit, the auxiliaries, and the appetites, the producers. It was an exploration of an ideal, a standard by which to measure existing societies, not a how-to guide for would-be dictators. But even if it was not his intention, the danger of Plato's thought lies in its core assumptions, that there is a single objective truth about how society should be organized, that only a select few are capable of knowing this truth, and that these few have the right to impose their vision on everyone else for their own good. This is the fundamental logic of totalitarianism. It is a logic that is profoundly anti-democratic and deeply contemptuous of the ability of ordinary people to govern themselves. Plato's legacy is a stark warning about the dangers of utopianism. The desire to create a perfect society, to wipe the slate clean and build a new world based on a rational plan is a powerful and seductive one. But it is a desire that has, time and again in history, led to tyranny. The road to serfdom is often paved with the plans of intellectuals who believe they know what is best for everyone. Plato, the fountainhead of Western philosophy, gave this dangerous idea its first and most eloquent expression. Can the pursuit of a perfect, rational order ever be reconciled with the preservation of human freedom? From the ancient world's dream of a perfect state, we leap forward 2,000 years to the chaotic, violent world of Renaissance Italy. Our final case study is not a utopian dreamer, but a ruthless pragmatist. He was a man who stared into the abyss of politics and did not blink. His name has become a synonym for cunning, cruelty, and bad faith. His most famous work was a slim volume that would become the Bible for tyrants for the next 500 years. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. To understand Machiavelli, you must understand the world that made him. He was born in Florence in 1469 into a world of dazzling artistic and intellectual achievement, the world of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. But it was also a world of brutal, incessant political turmoil. Italy was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of warring city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, the Papal States, all constantly scheming, forming alliances, and betraying each other. Foreign powers, France and Spain, repeatedly invaded, treating the Italian peninsula as their personal battlefield. This was a world where power was the only currency that mattered. It was the age of the Borgias, a family whose name became synonymous with corruption, nepotism, and political assassination. Machiavelli was not an armchair philosopher. He was a man of action. For 14 years, he served as a high-ranking diplomat and official in the Florentine Republic. He traveled on missions to the courts of kings and popes, observing the raw mechanics of power up close. He saw firsthand that the rulers who succeeded were not the ones who were pious, moral, and kind. The ones who succeeded were the ones who were decisive, cunning, and, when necessary, utterly ruthless. Then, in 1512, Machiavelli's world collapsed. The Medici family, who had previously ruled Florence, returned to power with the help of a Spanish army. The Republic was overthrown, and Machiavelli, as a prominent official of the old regime, was purged. He was arrested, imprisoned, and brutally tortured on suspicion of conspiracy. He was eventually released, but was exiled from Florence, barred from the political life that was his passion. It was in this state of bitter, forced retirement that he wrote his masterpiece, The Prince. The Prince, written in 1513, is unlike any political treatise that came before it. For centuries, political philosophy had been a branch of moral philosophy. Thinkers from Plato to the Christian scholastics had written about how a ruler ought to behave, what virtues he should cultivate to be a good and just king. Machiavelli swept all of this away. He was not interested in how a ruler ought to live. He was interested in what a ruler must do to gain and maintain power in the real world. His approach was brutally realistic, pragmatic, and amoral. He famously declared that a prince who wishes to maintain his rule must learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not according to necessity. This was the great Machiavellian rupture, the separation of politics from traditional Christian morality. He argued that the ethics that apply to an ordinary citizen are different from the ethics that apply to a ruler. A ruler's primary duty is to preserve the state, and if he must resort to immoral means, deceit, violence, treachery, to achieve that end, then he must be willing to do so. This is the source of the infamous, though often misquoted, idea that the end justifies the means. Machiavelli argued that in the world of politics, people judge by results. If a prince succeeds in conquering and maintaining his state, the means he used will always be judged honorable. He advises the prince that it is better to be feared than to be loved if you cannot be both. Love is held by a chain of obligation, which, since men are wicked, is broken at every opportunity for their own advantage. But fear is held by a dread of punishment which never fails. He introduces the concept of cruelty well used. He argues that a few swift, decisive acts of violence at the beginning of a ruler's reign can be more merciful in the long run than a policy of indecisive leniency, which allows for prolonged disorder, riots, and killings. He praises the ruthless tactics of Cesare Borgia, who pacified a rebellious province by appointing a cruel governor to crush all opposition, and then, to win the favor of the people, had that same governor publicly executed and his body left in the town square. Machiavelli divides the challenges facing a ruler into two categories: those that can be overcome by virtù and those that are a matter of fortuna. Virtù, for Machiavelli, is not Christian virtue. It is a combination of skill, prowess, courage, and decisiveness. It is the ability to master a situation and impose one's will on events. Fortuna, or fortune, is the unpredictable, chaotic element of life, the things that are beyond a ruler's control. Machiavelli famously compares fortune to a raging river that can be contained by building dikes and dams during calm times. A prince with virtù can prepare for and mitigate the blows of fortune. The Prince is, in essence, a handbook for dictators. It is a cold, calculated analysis of how to acquire and maintain power in a world where morality is a liability and only results matter. For this, Machiavelli's name was reviled. The Catholic Church placed his book on the index of prohibited books. The term Machiavellian entered the English language as a synonym for diabolical cunning and political evil. He was seen as a teacher of evil, an advisor to tyrants. And his book was indeed read and reportedly put into practice by some of the most ruthless rulers in history. Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister to King Henry VIII, was said to be a student of Machiavelli's work as he engineered the English Reformation. In the 20th century, both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin are reported to have kept copies of The Prince by their bedsides. Mussolini wrote a doctoral thesis on it. It has been the constant companion of those who believe that political power grows from the barrel of a gun and is maintained by fear and deception. So, is Machiavelli a dangerous mind, the ultimate teacher of tyranny? The case seems open and shut. He provided a clear, unapologetic justification for the use of immoral means in politics. He divorced power from ethics and, in doing so, gave would-be tyrants a philosophical license for their crimes. His work seems to whisper in the ear of every dictator that their cruelty is not a vice, but a necessity. However, as with all the thinkers we have examined, there is a defense to be made. Some scholars have argued that The Prince was not a serious guide for rulers, but a brilliant satire. By laying bare the brutal methods of tyrants with such stark honesty, Machiavelli was, in fact, exposing their wickedness to the common people. It was a warning, not an endorsement. The book, according to this reading, is a work of Republican patriotism, designed to show citizens what they are up against. This interpretation gains strength when you consider Machiavelli's other major political work, The Discourses on Livy. In this much longer book, Machiavelli reveals his true political sympathies. He praises the virtues of a republican form of government with its checks and balances, its rule of law, and its reliance on a citizen militia. He argues that a republic is more stable, more adaptable, and ultimately more glorious than a principality. The Machiavelli of the Discourses seems to be a champion of liberty, not a tutor of tyrants. So how do we reconcile these two Machiavellis? Perhaps The Prince was a specific piece of advice for a specific desperate situation. He wrote it during his exile and dedicated it to the new Medici ruler, perhaps in a cynical attempt to win back his political position. Or perhaps it was a patriotic plea. The final chapter of The Prince is an impassioned call for a strong leader to rise up, drive out the foreign invaders, and unify a broken and humiliated Italy. He may have believed that in such a desperate time, only a ruthless Machiavellian prince could succeed. Ultimately, Machiavelli's danger lies in his profound and unsettling realism. He was one of the first thinkers to look at politics not as it should be, but as it actually is. He saw that the world of power operates according to its own cold logic, a logic that is often at odds with our personal morality. Whether he was endorsing this logic or merely describing it, his work has had a powerful and often pernicious influence. He gave a name and a theory to a style of politics that has always existed and will likely always exist, the politics of whatever it takes. We have journeyed through 2.5 millennia of thought. We have stood with Plato in his ideal city, a monument of reason and a prison of the soul. We have walked with Machiavelli through the treacherous corridors of power. We have listened to Rousseau's call for a freedom so absolute it must be forced upon us. We have witnessed Nietzsche's brilliant insights twisted into a justification for genocide. And we have traced Marx's dream of emancipation to the gates of the gulag. Each of these minds was brilliant. Each was responding to the crises of their time. None of them personally ordered an execution or ran a concentration camp. They were men of words, of ideas. And yet, their ideas, when they escaped the seminar room and entered the political arena, became entangled in some of the greatest crimes in human history. So we are left with the final haunting question. What is the nature of a dangerous idea? Is an idea dangerous because it is inherently evil? Or does its danger lie in its ambiguity, its ripeness for distortion? Is it the philosopher's fault if their complex thoughts are reduced to simple, brutal slogans by political actors? When Nietzsche wrote of the Übermensch, could he have foreseen the master race? When Marx wrote of the dictatorship of the proletariat, could he have envisioned the Great Purge? When Rousseau wrote of forcing men to be free, could he have heard the distant fall of the guillotine? Perhaps the danger is not in the ideas themselves, but in the human hunger for certainty. In a complex and frightening world, totalizing ideologies that claim to have all the answers, that divide the world neatly into good and evil, friends and enemies, the saved and the damned, are incredibly seductive. The philosophies we have examined, in their most distorted forms, provided this certainty. They gave a moral justification for tribal hatreds, a scientific rationale for political violence, and a utopian promise to justify present-day atrocities. This story is a profound, cautionary tale about the responsibility that comes with thought. An idea, once it is released into the world, takes on a life of its own. It can be used in ways its creator never intended, for purposes they would have abhorred. The power of these thinkers is a testament to the fact that philosophy is not a harmless academic game. It is a deadly serious business. The questions philosophers ask about justice, about freedom, about the nature of a good society are the questions that shape our world. The legacy of these dangerous minds is not a reason to stop thinking, but a reason to think more carefully, more critically, more humbly. It is a reminder that any idea that promises a perfect future is likely to create a hellish present. It is a warning that the most dangerous people are often not the cynical and the wicked, but the true believers, the idealists who are so convinced of their own righteousness that they are willing to sacrifice humanity for the sake of their vision of humanity. We live today in an age of new and powerful ideologies, an age of digital prophets and online mobs, an age where ideas can spread across the globe in an instant. The battle for the human mind is more intense than ever. And as we navigate this treacherous landscape, we would do well to remember the lessons of these brilliant and terrifyingly dangerous philosophical minds. For their stories teach us the most important lesson of all, that the most powerful weapon ever created is a single compelling idea, and we must handle it with the utmost care.